I think the most important thing I can point out about the nature of this book is not the title, but the subtitle, which was No More Cookie Cutter High Schools. Told some folks earlier, we joked with the publisher, this Corwin. They persisted that you couldn't have a book title that start with the word no. And so that was our original title, was the cookie cutter part. And we think that's the more telling part of the book in terms of the big idea. Because we think there's lots of ways to make high schools, not just one way. And I bet all of us went to high schools that shared some real characteristics. That it was classroom-based instruction, one teacher, 25 kids in a room, one discipline at a time, math or English or whatever. The schools were organized around departments. Bells rung every hour or thereabouts to tell you when to move from one discipline to the other. Low level of technology and when most of us were there. But this is a different time, and the world has changed a bunch, and I think there are, in fact, multiple ways to make high schools, and so that's one of the things we'll talk about. To give you a brief introduction to the two guys that I worked on with whom I worked on the book. Ted McCain, they both live in British Columbia. Ted McCain teaches in a high school there. He absolutely believes his calling in life is to be in a classroom with kids. He uses project-based learning to teach digital literacy classes, and he's quite remarkable. He's written 6 or 7 other books, and brilliant guy. Ian Jukes, you may know more about. Jukes is a former school administrator and teacher, but in fact for years and years has traveled the world lecturing to educational groups, and both of these guys are really lively characters. It was great fun to bang heads with them and put this book together. So this is the point that I started with, that there are lots of ways to make high schools, and I hope I can leave you convinced that in fact not only is there not one way, but we need to sit down every time we start a high school and figure out what's the right thing for that high school. And that the fact that you have one over here and one over there doesn't mean that a new one over there shouldn't be different than either of those. And so often we just take for granted what a high school is. And the question is, what color brick do we put on the outside, and how do we arrange the classrooms? And I think we need to back up from that and think more fundamentally about what a school can be. This is a funny diagram that I always talk about. I refer to this as the elements of schooling. And I don't know whether I've got the right list of elements here, the sort of the basic components that make up schooling. But even if I've missed one or two and you want to add one or subtract one, it doesn't matter. The notion is that all of these things are absolutely related to each other. They are integrally related. They're connected to each other. And that the school experience that teachers and kids have is a function of how all these things relate to each other. That you can't pull out one without affecting the others. So for example, if we want to teach kids in a certain way, it affects the technology we use. It affects how the school day should be organized. It affects the spaces we would provide, and it affects, of course, what schooling is going to cost. And just as you guys discovered last year, the legislature fiddled with the cost category, and it darn well rippled its way around the rest of that circle. The trick is that in a lot of school districts, and it's worse as school districts get bigger, each one of these is in fact a separate department in the district. They have an assistant superintendent that heads them, and they operate as silos, and they're largely independent of each other. And that recognition of how they interact with each other isn't particularly there. And what happens is, even though somebody has a brilliant idea for some piece of this about the use of technology, if nothing else changes in response to that idea, then all those other things become constraints on the potential for success of whatever the improvement is they're trying to make. And so my point is that in these models that we're going to show you, different ways to make schools, we tried to be thoughtful about that whole a collection of things. And this, never mind, I know none of you can see what this funny chart's about over here, but we set out in the book 17 principles that we thought were important, that things we should have in mind and try to achieve on if we were doing a new school. And so we took each one of the models that we created, and we, in essence, went back and measured it against our own principles to see how they performed. And the interesting thing is that they all perform differently, which is to say that if you're really thoughtful about the community you're going to serve and the kids you're going to serve, one of these models may be a lot better than another, or some model we haven't even thought of, which is to say you need to be really thoughtful about who you're going to serve and what you need for them, and then make a school that's responsive, and that there's no cookie cutter thing that you can't just keep stamping them out. So that's the critical part. There are 10 models in the book. I'm going to briefly go through each of these, and for each I want to, let me back up a second. For each of these, I'm going to show you an organizing sort of diagram that talks about how they relate to each other spatially. And then I'm going to show you something about how time, both the school year and the school day are organized, because I think time is every bit as important as how we lay out the building physically, etc. And then there are some things that all of these have in common. One is that we have assumed that technology is ubiquitous. Everybody's got it. You can forget it. It's like, I don't know about you guys, but around our office we have computers all over the place. Nobody thinks about technology. It's something that we can't imagine the place without it. If the power goes off, we all just go home. And I think our schools need to operate the same way, because all the kids have got things in their pockets. They've got them in their bedroom at home. And we need to get to the point where it's a tool and it helps us. It's not something special. It's stuck on the side. And so we've assumed that there's that level of technology in all these. And the second thing is we've assumed that time is super flexible in some way or another. So you'll see that the schedules are important as you go through all of these. So let's talk about each one of the models briefly. We have the first one is what we call academy schools. And academies integrate core instruction, English, math, social studies, etc., with elective and career studies. And the notion is that the elective and career studies give real-world connections, real-world meaning to the core studies that the kids are doing. And so when the kids come to the school, they select an area of study related to these, to the core subjects, and everything they do in math and English and social studies is related to that. So that if they write a paper in English, for example, it might be related to the field of study that they're talking in, whether it was medicine or computer technology or construction or whatever. And it's that connection that gives everything meaning and helps kids see why their studies are relevant to the real world. To do this, we've organized the school around if I get these buttons right, around a series of small learning communities. So the school is broken down. The academies are physical places. It's just how this affects the facility. And so the academies have the core spaces for English, math, social studies, etc. And they also have places for the career, and they're all organized together. In most high schools, you'll have all the academic stuff over here and the CTE stuff over there. In this case, they're all knitted together and integrated. This school, the kids take way more CTE as electives than normal. So this school is focused entirely on academic studies. It does not have extensive extracurricular activities, but it is a full high school that the kids can go there, receive, graduate, etc. So, and these academies may take on all sorts of different subjects. Some of them may be around technology, some of them may be around the law and business and finance, some of them around medicine. You could have one around performing and visual arts. So the number of these academies and the nature of them will be dependent on the school district. This, and I'll show you an example here in a minute, and I'll tell you about how they pick their academies, which is an important part of the notion. In every case, one of the things you're going to see is that we have looked for some way to make time flexible in these schools. In most cases, we have assumed, and in every case, we have assumed that schooling operates all year long. And it does that precisely because of the flexibility it gives kids and parents about when they're in school and what they do, and it makes the schooling a continual service, not a seasonal event. I really think the notion of closing, if we consider what we spend on a high school or an elementary school, the idea of closing an asset like that for a quarter of the year doesn't make much sense financially. It makes less sense educationally. And it's part of the problem we have with kids failing classes. It's not so much that the kid fails as they run out of time. And so we say, well, gee, you didn't get it in the time allowed, so go back and do it over again. So anyway, the notion is that you'll see that we've almost all the suggestions run for the full year. The second thing is that we've tried to find...
I have a question there real quick.
Uh-huh.
Wouldn't there have to be some sort of legislative action or something at the state level to make that possible?
Actually, the state has you should ask because I just talked with the TEA folks about this. The state requires, they have a minimum school year, but they don't have a maximum school year at all. And there's all sorts of possibilities and flexibility built into the law to allow exactly this. So they
Probably breaks at different times, maybe year-round concepts.
Yeah, but they nail you on the minimum end, not on the maximum end. It's perfectly legal and right. You wouldn't have to do anything to do this. Some of the other things you.
It goes without saying, too, I hope too, exactly may challenge assumptions though.
Yeah.
With some things he says, he's going to challenge current practice as it is.
Exactly.
Just exploring.
The other thought here, and you'll see all sorts of versions of this, at the upper right, the green part is a typical school week in school days. And the proposal here, and you'll see variations on this, is that we break the day into modular segments of about 20 minutes each, and you assemble time you need for various kinds of school work by assembling these modules. The notion is that it just doesn't make sense to have the same time allotted for everything every single day. If you're doing a seminar discussing a book, you might need one period of time. If you're doing a major lab experience, you might need more time. So it starts to treat school time like the real world, where we schedule time based on what we're going to do. The key to doing this is that the black time, the sort of empty cells up there, are independent study time, where the kids have some, they get to work on their own. And that's what allows the flexibility, and it also gives the kids time to assume responsibility for their own studies to an extent, and to use their technology. Well, there's a school in the Springs, and for each one of these I'm going to show you some precedents, either in terms of actual schools or publications, etc. This one is modeled out of after the Wenche Senior High School in the Springs School District, just on the north side of Houston. This one serves 1,500 students. It's organized around 3 academies, and it's been open now 5 or 6 years, and it is a school of choice. Kids have to elect to come to this school. They've had more applicants than seats every semester since it opened, and this school has consistently had higher test scores than their other 3 schools from the first semester it opened. So the kids like to come here. They want to stay here. They're engaged in their work, and they've had fewer disciplinary issues as well. Well, another model we dubbed instructional center schools. And the idea in this one is that the school is not organized around departments, but it's organized around a series of space, oops, I keep pushing the wrong button, a series of spaces, and each one of that's a blow-up of one of these on the right here, but it contains places for kids to work and for teachers to work. The teachers don't have classrooms. They come to, they sort of office in this space for precisely the purpose that kids can get to the teachers when they need them. The kids, the school, let me back up a second. The school is organized around 4 modes of instruction. They get the basic delivery of material digitally. The teachers, in the past in this idea, I'm going to show you in a minute how this is a really old idea. In the past they had large group instruction, they had lecture halls. The idea here is that is replaced by digital technology, that the lectures in fact are delivered online, and the kids can listen to those at 8 in the morning or 8 o'clock at night or 2 in the morning. They can listen to them repeatedly. So the basic content is delivered that way. Then they have small group instruction where the kids get together with teachers in smaller groups and talk to each other and haggle over ideas, etc. The third mode of instruction is called hands-on. This is where they do laboratory work, studio work, art classes where they need some specialized equipment, or like a music class where they do something which is a group endeavor. And the fourth mode of instruction, I think, is the most important of all, which is the reason for the schedule that you'll see, is independent study time, where the kids have responsibility for knitting all this together and pursuing their own studies. So this school would have, the key are these working spaces, but they may have some classrooms, some laboratory spaces, etc. around the school that the kids draw on as the proceeds. Well, the school year here looks very much like the first one we showed you with the modular scheduling. This happens to be the school that developed the idea in the first place. It means that every day is different for every kid, which is the way real life works. This school, let me show you the. This is the book that the school was based on. It was written by a guy named J. Lloyd Trump for the National Association of Secondary School Principals. The amazing thing about this book to me is it was written in 1959. In 1959, Trump outlined this notion. He argued classrooms are too small for effective delivery. That is, if the teacher stand in front of 25 kids and gave the same lecture 5 times a day, he felt was a waste of time. Why couldn't the teacher give the lecture once and then have the rest of the day to work with kids in small groups and individually? And he also argued that, that kids would be using electronic learning devices. And this was in 1959, and computers then filled rooms this size. And I still think it's not even a book, it's a pamphlet. And just pound for pound, it's an extraordinary book. This is a high school in Omaha, Nebraska called Westside, which has been following the notions of this book since 1967, and it's an amazing place. There are no bells because they don't have any scheduled classes or periods. Kids are wandering the hall all the time because that's what they're supposed to be doing. The campus is open for kids in if they keep their grades up and stuff, for their 11th and 12th grade kids. They can come and go from the campus, go off campus to eat, etc. Just the whole attitude towards kids, the responsibility they assume, and the way they work and stuff is pretty remarkable. I think the school has, I'll say 1,800 kids at the moment, so this is a substantial high school.
Let me ask a question on the time constraints and on the 12-month school year. Address for me then, when you talk about mastery for each kid, a lot of time in here difference. What if a kid is excelling at a faster rate than another child during that whole time year? Are they able to excel?
Yes.
So in fact, perhaps maybe get finished prior to a 4-year?
Yes, and I'm going to show you some other versions where that is more feasible than this, but my notion about the use of time is that we need to make the time serve the kid instead of the kid serving time. And so if a kid needs some more time to succeed, why don't we help them? And rather than failing them and sending them back to lose a year of their life and do the whole thing over again, it'd be cheaper and more effective to give them some tutoring help, etc., and help them succeed. So maybe if it takes them every other kid, the normal time is say 2 months. If it takes another 3 weeks, give it to them. Conversely, if a kid has eaten the cover off the book in the first month, why not let them move on? But to do that, you can't have bells ringing, and the school year can't be a drop-dead sort of deadline. But there are some of these models where I'll call it synchronous study, where kids working together is a huge advantage. And so I've tried in all these models to provide some flexibility, but at other times we've provided for synchronous study. I think sometimes kids talking to each other and working as a group is a really positive thing. And so the question is, how can you have some of both? And some of the models will do that.
I've got a question. Is this particular school that you just showed us, is it diverse, socioeconomically diverse?
Yes. Yep. In fact, the interesting thing about that school is that in Nebraska, a kid can transfer from any district to another district, providing they have space to accommodate the kids, and the state funds go with them, so they move with the student. And this school, I've forgotten now, I want to say they've got out of their 1,800 kids, 400 or 500 of them are from other districts. So and over the years, the school has become much more diverse. It used to be in a really relatively affluent, et cetera, but that was long ago. So it's a pretty broad.
But it has very low income kids,
It's
medium,
yeah, precisely, yeah.
And how long did you say that?
It's since 1967. And this school got one-to-one computing, I don't know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago. And the trick was, of all the schools that particularly the old industrial typical high schools that most of us went to, technology is either an interruption to what they're doing, or it's some sort of peculiar accessory and it sort of sits on the side and they're not quite sure what to do with it. In this case, it simply supplanted a process that they had, and everything else stayed the same. So the large group instruction is now being done more effectively digitally, And so, I mean, this was a school that was, that's one of the reasons we used it for a model, because these guys were set up for the future 53 years ago. Pretty amazing place.
It's not to expect a report when you visit your daughter.
Okay.
Attends the University of Nebraska.
Uh-huh. Yeah, yeah.
The excuse to get Omaha.
Yeah, oh, Omaha's wonderful. Well, these schools, I jokingly refer to these as the keep it simple, stupid schools. But the better title, of course, is academic focus. And the reason is that these folks are so clear about what they want to do. This is not about making a comprehensive high school that serves everybody for everything. These guys have said, we want to do this, and boy, do they do it well. So the point of these schools is their narrow focus, and these are aimed at getting kids through school, very high graduation rate, and sending kids to college. And the way they do that is that they have virtually no extracurricular activities. They work longer school days. They have a longer school year, and they basically just work everybody's can off. But the kids think it's wonderful. The kids buy into this because kids, these schools, and I'll explain in a minute what the example is, but these schools are aimed at low-income kids who have come from an environment where few people have graduated from high school, much less gone to college, where they sort of have low expectations for their academic future. And they graduate the kids and they send them all to college. And the key is that the kids who come to these schools haven't been very successful in the past. They have low expectations for themselves. And son of a gun, they discover that they can do it, and they suck themselves into the process. The more they succeed, the more they want to succeed. And so the environment we've created is a series of small spaces or families. So there's a lot of nurture and support for the kids. They engage the parents. The instruction is digital, as we've mentioned before, but with lots of support and monitoring from the faculty. There are no extracurricular activities. The focus of the school day is 8 to 5. There's absolute focus on the academics, so that there's no time for other things. And the school facility is very simple compared to what most of us think of as a high school facility. These have very, very simple facilities. They may have some contacts with things outside the school to enrich their studies, but the big focus here is staying on task about graduating and going to college. So this one is organized as the same 12-month school year with quarters, but there are intersessions. The notion here is that they just do not let a student fail. They give the student extra support and help to succeed. So if a student falls behind, in fact, you can see on the school week up here, see the little box on the right, that's Saturday. If a kid falls behind, they know it immediately, and they bring the student in and give them extra help on Saturdays, etc. They do not want them falling far off the pace. But if they get farther off the pace, then they have periods between the quarters, and they give the kids extra help there. The notion is that the kid, by the time they finish that intercession period, they're ready to go on the next year. They don't let a kid get behind, and failure is just not an option. The school is organized. The school week, as you can see in the daily schedules here, is organized in series of big blocks of time so they can do interdisciplinary work. The time within those big blocks, the teachers control. They start with advisories in the morning. Advisories are typical in a bunch of schools. They're what I used to think of as homeroom, except that they weren't where they checked you in and out of the school during the day. They literally, it's sort of a point of touching base with every single individual. Just how are you doing today? You got any problems at home? How are you feeling today? Here's what are you going to be doing today? It's almost like a counselor. An advisor works rather like a counselor, but they're constantly there.
What's the, from some examples, what's the size of most of these top schools? What's the ratio?
They're fairly small. They're 500, 600, 700 kids or something like that at the max. They're smaller than what I normally associate as a Texas high school.
What would be the ratio of student-teacher?
Well, it's fairly high because everybody on the campus teaches. They don't have the, as I mentioned, the athletic staff, etc. So everybody there has a focus, a hand in the curriculum. one of the most extraordinary things when I was investigating all this stuff, I wanted to make an appointment with the principal of one of these high schools in Houston. And so I rang this lady up, and she couldn't have been nicer and stuff, but we had a really hard time getting our schedules to work where I could go by and visit with her. And then she said, well, I'm sorry, but the problem is I teach 2 sections of algebra, and so we have to work around that. And I don't know another high school principal is teaching 2 sections of algebra or anything else. Their requirement was that all their administrators teach. They wanted them to have a hands-on relationship with kids. And so it's a very small sort of environment where everybody gets to know everybody, and pretty amazing place. And then you can see the rest of the days are organized in big blocks of time that give you a lot more, still gives you a schedule, but a lot more flexibility. Charter schools, the KIP Knowledge is Power program, started in Houston, but it's now in all sorts of places in the country. Houston and in New York. The YES programs are there. The one that the two they'll probably be surprised is the School of the Woods was a private Montessori high school in Houston, but in fact the schedule looks very much like that. The focus, the clarity of what they're doing looks like that, and very creative about how they go about doing things. And their school is 2 floors of a small suburban office building in Houston, so it's not facilities are not the big deal for these guys. The High Tech High is in San Diego, very interesting school. And there's one other school that I've neglected to put on the list. I think academic alternative schools, not the disciplinary sort, but we've done a number of them, been involved in a number of them. And the interesting thing is that all they do is they take the kids out of the big, complex high school environment, simplify life, give them more support, focus, and the very kids who are dropping out of the big high school succeed in this other environment. It's the simplicity of the environment and the clarity of the focus that helps these kids succeed. And again, their facilities are incredibly simple. We did one recently. We took over a piece of an old admin building and made it into an alternative school, and it's been a great success.
I have a question. Have y'all seen any problems with kids having social interaction problems moving on if they go to college, where they don't learn how to, I mean, if they're just sitting, if they're focused all the time on just academics and not the rest of the thing? I mean, because,
Yeah.
you know, said you taught at Texas A&M. Well, it's a huge school, lots of school spirit, lots of things going on. Do these kids get lost in all that when they go to college?
I would argue it's exactly the opposite, because most of these schools are based around small groups where the kids get to know each other better and have a lot more contact. One of the difficulties in the big school is that kids move from class to class to class every time a bell rings. The kids in one class may not have anything to do with the kids in the next class. And whereas within this setting, they're organized in small groups, so they'll see the same faces and same teachers more, and that they would actually have more contact with each other. And it's not a function so much of the size of the school as the organization of the school, which is
Well,
what...
I'm talking about all the other things that go along with going to college. A lot of times it's not just focus on the academics, all the other things, the outside things. Not being used to going to the ball games and being part of the school spirit and all that. Do they have a hard time going to college and making that transition?
Not that I know of. And some of these you'll see, some of these do not have extracurricular activities, and some of them absolutely do. Yeah, but that's not consistent on all these at all. And generally speaking, the ones that we suggested not have extracurricular activities, it was a focus of the time, how they were using the school day, and how much time was available for those other things. So, learning lab schools, I don't know if any of you have ever been to an architectural school, but this in fact is how us architects have been taught for since the 19th century. But it's called, now we call it project-based instruction, but it's all the same stuff. And the notion is that you use projects to knit together and integrate all the separate disciplines that you go to. It's really tough on kids when you bell ring and they go from math class to social studies class or whatever, to figure out how all those things fit together. We sort of leave it up to the kids to figure out the higher order thinking skills and the application of these things in a real world setting. And that's what project-based learning is all about. Well, we've suggested in this school that we organize the school spatially around what in an architecture school would be called studios or drafting studios or design spaces. And that this is one of them down here on the lower left. And every student has a workstation there. The teachers, a group of teachers, core teachers, also have their workstations there. And everything is taught through projects. So they give the kids assignments. There may be some direct instruction, which are the little green dots up there. Those may be classrooms, and there's some direct instruction in specific things, but that direct instruction is given meaning by what happens in the studio. So they will have a studio that will require that they draw on something they did in history, illustrate it with something they learned in a technology class, calculate something that they did in math. And kids in this process keep portfolios of their work. They make presentations. So this whole space down the middle of the school is really a big gallery where they display things that they've done. And the school is very glassy and open on the inside, so that as you move through, you can see into these spaces and see all the work that the kids are doing. This school absolutely needs contact with the outside world. That's what that funny skyline down there is supposed to indicate, because that's where the project, you want to use real world projects to solve some problem that you could imagine and being in the real world, and you may bring people in from outside the campus to work with kids on some specific projects to, again, to make that contact. Well, the schedule on this one is different in the sense the way a school week is organized. Again, you see the modular scheduling. But the notion then is that at least 3 afternoons a week is entirely devoted just to the project work, so that you block out that time. And this is one of those cases where I mentioned where some of these, where synchronous study is really important. You want the kids working on the same projects at the same time, because no matter how good the teachers are, the kids who are trying to solve the problems talking to each other, and the kids will sort of instinctively want to go in separate directions. I don't want my project to be like his project, but here's why I'm trying to solve it. The other kid will be solving it in different ways, and it's that dialogue of the kids working on the projects. It's absolutely terrific. Because there's no cheating involved, because there's no right or wrong answer. There's different projects that can be done different ways, and the idea is that each kid, the real advantage is the digging in and the thinking part, which is what higher order thinking skills are all about. Well, there's all sorts of interesting books on this. There's a book called Breaking Ranks, a terrific book of NASSP that was written by a guy named Ernest Boyer. And at the same time, in the mid-90s, when he was working on that book, he was also writing a book called Building Community, which is about architectural education. Ted McCain was one of the co-authors on the book, wrote a splendid little book called Teaching for Tomorrow about project-based instruction. He uses it in based on his own high school teaching. And then this is a school in Minneapolis. Everybody calls it the Zoo School, but it's the Minneapolis School for Environmental Studies, and it's on the campus of the Minneapolis Zoo, and a beautiful wooded setting and stuff. But the school is organized around a series of learning studios, and each one has a workstations for every single student has a place to work. And then there's this big open flexible space in the middle with tables and chairs and rolling blackboards and projectors and computers and stuff. And the kids and the teachers rearrange the place and make it what it needs to be every single day. There are no classrooms in the school. Each one of these has a science lab with it for experiments, etc. But there's not a classroom in the entire school. And this has been operating since, I think, '94. Really, really interesting school. These are some shots from the Rice School of Architecture. That's where I went to school, so I was able to purloin these photographs. But these are shots of the architecture school, and the sense is very much the same. The architectural drafting rooms are always a mess because the kids are in there making things, and they're doing projects, and they're drawing with their computers, etc. And it's that liveliness of the environment that I think it makes it so wonderful, and the kids talking to each other. The other thing is that at the end of projects, and this applies to project-based learning in high schools as well, the kids make presentations. They stand up and explain to other folks what they did, why they did it, and they have discussions. There may be faculty members from other studios there. There may be people from the community, and this dialogue is just absolutely superb. It's one of the best parts of project-based learning are the presentations and the dialogues. And in the end, not only do the kids get a grade, but they keep portfolios. And this is true also of the school in Omaha. The kids have been keeping portfolios there for, I don't know how many years, but decades. And that's the kids' record. When they come out, they not only just have a transcript, but they actually have a collection of things that they've done. For architecture kids, they take this out, and that's how they interview for their first jobs. Well, these are some publications and groups There's a group called the New Tech Foundation that does project-based learning. They have 2 schools here in Texas, one in Manor and one in Coppell, but they've got a whole series of project-based learning schools across the country. And then there's a splendid little school called the Starlane Center in Wyoming, where a bunch of teachers wanted to do project-based learning, and somehow they conned the district into buying an old Denny's restaurant, and they went off and did a whole project-based learning thing there, and it's terrific. And so they wrote a book about their experience called What Box?
Can I stop you a second? Since you mentioned 2, you said Manor and Coppell.
Coppell, yeah.
Coppell. Tell me, because I know they call them, I think, New Tech High Schools, things like
Correct.
that. So how did that, back to that other slide, that foundation help? Was that the premise?
What the New
their-
Tech Foundation, they refer to them, I think, they refer to themselves as a school development corporation or something like that. They're a nonprofit, something or other. But they provide the expertise on project-based learning. They provide a staff development. They provide materials related to it. And so they come in and help you program the campus and get it fired up and running. And they're pretty super people. And they've got lots of experience now. Their first school was in Napa, but they've got, I don't know how many schools they've got total now. Do you know? It's 30 or 40 or something. There's a bunch of them.
I'm not as familiar with Mainers, I guess, but I know in Coppell they repurposed a school for this.
And that seems to be what they do most of the time. Their very first school in Napa was in an old building. What they do, and the one we did in Coppell is the same thing. What they do is go in and take out the partition between every other classroom. They insist that the teachers all work in pairs, and they pair typically like math and science, social studies, history, and they sort of double block the time that way so that those 2 teachers have control of a 2-hour period and that many kids. They may do half of one thing one time and half the other. They may do all science one period, all math the next period. And the whole idea is that there's this multidisciplinary approach. And then they have breakout spaces where kids can get out of the classroom and work in small groups in different settings. And so it's been very ingenious. I think that they've done most of that. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen one where they started from scratch and built a new school. Well, this is based on another book by J. Lloyd Trump. This one was written in 1977, and he outlined a fully individualized, self-paced instruction program. The idea is way more feasible today than it was then, but he in fact pulled it off, and there are still a bunch of schools that are doing his suggestion. The notion was that every single kid worked under the guidance of a teacher, but they were working at their own pace. They were given, in essence, a workbook, sort of a work textbook, and as the kid worked through this, when they finished out, and the teacher agreed, they would take a test, and if they passed, etc., they moved on to the next book. So and if a kid did that in a month, fine. If it took another kid 6 weeks, it didn't matter. And so the whole thing was a continuing process. I think what they did originally was fairly crude because of the nature of the workbooks. If you substituted something digital for that was really rich and had links to the whole world, etc., then the possibilities are really quite extraordinary. So that's what we tried to do with this model. And so the notion is that the school is organized around a series of advisories, which are the little dots here, and within that there's again workstations for the teachers and a teacher and the kids. There's one teacher and about 15 kids in an advisory. The sole purpose of the advisory is to give the kids support. So that and again, it's acting like a counselor. The student can get counseling about where to go for help, what to do. The teacher can keep track of how they're working to keep them from getting one part of their studies out of sync with the other part, etc. So that's what happens in these spaces in the center of the school. Around the perimeter, there's supporting spaces that might be seminar rooms, laboratories, music spaces, performing arts things, athletic spaces, etc., that the kids would go and draw on as they needed in the course of their studies. So for example, a kid who was doing science would go to the science lab, but they wouldn't have group science things they would work on. They would do science experiments, but they would do them individually, and there would be a teacher in the lab to help them, support them in that work. So it's highly individualized.
All these models, I was thinking about that. I was in a very crude model of this when I was in junior high school. And another benefit to me, and I assume would work here, is that students who are ahead and move forward are a great asset to help those who are behind and move forward.
That's part of the idea of the advisories, because the kids are sitting there, they're not all doing the same thing, but they all have access to each other, and they get to know each other, and they talk, and all these kids have a chance to, I mean, in architecture school, I mentioned that one of the best things about architecture is talking to the other kids,
Yeah.
plus the faculty, of course. But in a lot of times, I think the way schools are organized, where you have kids in grade level blocks and they move through, you're not in with a diverse group of kids where you necessarily have access to the other kids for that sort of input. The one thing that's really different about this schedule, well, one, you can see the time, there's no quarters, no nothing, because if you've got kids who can stop and start, etc., then there's no reason to have the school year broken up into hunks. I want to think about, and there's a couple of other models that do this, I'd like to think about schooling as a continuous service, not a seasonal event. That it doesn't stop and start so kids can bring in the crops or any of this stuff. It's like a hospital. It's there, and it provides kids with support and instruction and materials, etc. But that doesn't mean that the school days still don't need a bit of organization. So what we proposed here is that across the top of this are meetings of the advisories, where you get together and you just talk to each other, what are you doing, etc., and everybody's sort of checked in and acknowledged, etc. The rest of the day, though, is totally unscheduled, except that those boxes that you see that are sort of empty are what I've called activity periods. And the notion is that during those periods of the day, kids are scheduled when they can have access to a science lab or a math teacher or somebody. And so these are simply availability periods, if you will. So if a kid at 3 o'clock in the afternoon says, holy mackerel, I don't know how to solve this quadratic equation or something, he'll know that at 4 o'clock that afternoon he can get to a math teacher. And so the notion is this just helps distribute kids across the day so that they can, that all of them show up at the same place at the same time, et cetera. So this is really a supporting sort of notion. Well, there are a bunch of schools still pursuing this, even though I think the technology, the way they were doing it and the way these are doing it is now out of date. But if you put the digital part in, then I think it's terrific. And so don't ask me why, because there were some of these schools. There was one in Houston years ago. But there's a bunch of these schools in Canada still underway, and I've been to visit the one in Mill Bay in British Columbia. Well, this is a model that I think has some really important thoughts in it. But the guy who did this, I think, sort of undid himself in the process. But it's a really important notion. I call it time less or more, and it's based on a book called Jefferson's Children by a guy named Leon Botstein. Botstein is president of the Bard College in New York, also conducts a symphony orchestra. I've always wanted to meet him because the guy who's doing both of those must have a brain in there someplace. But his big point is that he believes that kids today are maturing physically and mentally, intellectually, a year or two earlier than they were when the whole notion of high school was developed in the first place. And he thinks that kids ought to be making the sort of decisions, transitions in their life that they now make after the 12th grade. He thinks they should be doing that a year or two earlier in life. And so the diagrams up here look at, on the column on the left, the way schooling was organized before World War II. That is basically K-8 and 9-12. Then after World War II, we introduced the junior high, which at that time was grades 7, 8, and 9, and high school only had 3 grades then, 10, 11, and 12. To the current situation we've got, where middle school is grades 6, 7, and 8. And what he suggested in his book is, it's the fourth of the columns with the color there, is that you would start kindergarten a year earlier, that you would switch from primary schools to secondary schools between the 6th and 7th grade, and that you would graduate at the end of the 11th grade. The notion is not that this is a reduced area course of study, but that you would complete it at a different point in your life. And I thought this was really pretty interesting, and so we did a model that showed the 7-11 schools here. We proposed treating the middle schools around a series of pods, and the upper level schools around the sort of learning labs that we've seen in the other models. The point here is not so critical about the way this is organized, but this whole different approach of time. And I suspect the state would be all over our case about this one. But nonetheless, I thought that the idea was really worth thinking about, was a valid notion. So this one would have two different time schedules going on in the middle of the day, would be organized around quarters, etc. But again, those aren't so important as this notion of the time. Okay, this is another school model based on individualized instruction. But this one is a more modern take on the on Trump's book. In this school, the school is really a series of sub-schools. The idea of small learning communities within schools has been around at least since the early 60s. This one proposes that the learning communities consist of a family of about 120 to 150 kids composed of advisories, and each one of these are simply providing a home base for kids on the campus. They are really almost a social, supportive context for teaching and learning. But the trick is that each kid who comes to the school has an individualized learning plan, totally individualized. Each kid comes to the school, and they have to select something that they're passionate about, that they really care about in life, and they find a mentor for that student in that field off campus. And so the instruction is partly what happens on campus, partly what happens with their mentor off campus. Parents are highly engaged in the school, and everything else is totally individualized. So there are no classes, there are no bells, and the kids meet in the advisories a little bit during the week, and they're off campus, and I'll show you that in a minute. But you can see the critical thing here is the relationship between the school and the community. This is a school that could not exist without its community, and where it goes and how it relates and stuff. So in fact, this, and I'll show you in a second, but the school example I'm going to show you, the folks that are doing this, actually the original one of these was in Providence, Rhode Island, and they have 3 of these learning communities on one campus. They have one in an office building downtown and one in a neighborhood must be 3/4 of a mile away from the main campus. Where these pieces are is not so important relative to the school as it is to their link to the community. And I think it's a terrific idea about giving the kids real world contact. Well, this is what the schedule looks like. 3 days a week, the kids are on campus. They come to the campus, meet in their advisories. They make presentations to each other on the work they're doing, etc. So there's a real contact there. And during the course of the day, the students eat in their family, so it tries to provide for some of the social contacts, etc., that you're talking about. But otherwise, the kids are working independently. But they're working independently in a room that's not as big as this, so they have spaces where there's lots of contact, and they may all be doing different things, but they're there where they can talk to each other. The other 2 days of the week, Tuesday and Thursday, they're not on the campus at all. They go to their mentors, and they work, in essence, as a job. They're a full day pursuing things. So I've been to the school, and there was one kid who was interested in music, and they had a job for him in a recording lab. And there were all these things like this where they arrange positions for kids where they are effectively as part of their learning process. The incredibly important role here is of the advisors, who in essence sort of orchestrate this to be sure that it produces something effective for the kids. So the kids and the advisors and the parents and the mentors all work together, and instead of handing a kid a report card, they bring everybody comes on campus and they talk about this stuff. So evaluations are much more alive, and they're written assessments, written out in paragraphs and stuff, not A's and B's and C's on a card. Well, these schools are based on the notion of the big picture company schools. I've forgotten whether it's 40 or something. No, it's 63. I'm sorry, but they're all over a bunch of these across the country. And the big picture company is the group that put together the thinking of this, and still Elliot Levine and Bruce Litkey, or Dennis Litkey, I'm sorry, are the guys who put this together, and it really, really is a fascinating thing. And you meet some of the kids and the way they handle themselves. because they're not only not isolated on the campus 2 days per week, they've got to go out there and behave themselves in the real world. And the way these kids handle themselves and communicate and stuff is pretty terrific. Well, one other major type of schools, which we're all familiar with in some form or another, but we dubbed them cyber schools. Cyber schools aren't really a place, they're a process, they're a service. And the whole notion is that cyber schooling is something you do digitally, you do it online, etc. And therefore kids can study and learn and contact things anywhere and anytime. I think there are certainly some kids who may do all their education this way, but I think it's much more likely that this will be blended with any one of these other models, and we will see some things, some kids will take something on campus, something online, etc., and put together a rich package of materials. I think it's particularly important in terms of the breadth of things kids can take this way, and particularly in smaller, more rural communities, the access you could give kids, things you could give them access to that they couldn't possibly have if they've got a high school with 300 kids in it or something, and this could give them contacts with anything and at a price that they could afford, etc. The work is done online, but the kids may still have digital contact with a real teacher or a phone contact or something, so there's still contact, but it's a very different notion spatially about where the school is in the world and how kids might relate to a physical school and to a digital school. Well, scheduling on this means absolutely nothing, of course, because the whole idea is that it's available around the clock every single day of the year, and boy, does that change the nature of the game when you can make it work like that. Well, if you really want to blow your head, try Googling virtual school. I did the other day, and I got 27,600,000 hits in about 2 seconds. So this is a gigantic notion. Most of the states have their own virtual schools, but the variations and varieties and stuff. So there's this gigantic resource out there, and I think this is more likely to be something we use to enrich other forms of schooling. So super briefly, there are 2 other possibilities that all of these possibilities suggest, and they're certainly applicable to where you guys are. One is that if you've got all these different approaches to learning, we don't have to assume that they only apply to different kinds of schools in the sense that you do one over here and one over there. If you have a big high school, of course, definition of big in Texas is 3,000 kids or more, or something smaller, but the notion is if you break a big school down into small learning communities, maybe each one of those learning communities is a whole different approach to instruction. And kids could go in and say, I would like to be in this academy school and study my course subjects directly related to an elective. Another kid might say, gee, I want to do this digitally and online, etc. And another, I want to be totally self-paced. I want to finish my high school in 2 years and do something else. And I think you could make a high school where the whole thing is different. Now, I think you need a principal who's sort of King Kong, etc., to manage this, because all 4 of those, or 5 or whatever, could be running on different schedules. They would have different sorts of spaces. But I think that's what would make it wonderful for kids, is the variety of stuff within one campus. The other model suggests the very same thing, but on a district basis. We've long assumed that the only way to be fair to kids across a district with multiple high schools is to make all the high schools as much the same as we can in terms of the programs they offer, the teachers, the quality of schools, etc. And parity was defined as equality of access to things. I wonder if we shouldn't be looking at equality of outcomes, not access. And if we had different high schools in a district, should we step back and look at the district as a market and say, well, gee, we've got kids with one interest over here, we've got this part of the city, it's got this gigantic industry, et cetera, that we have a community that has all sorts of different interests and needs, and be sure that we're providing high school experiences that are supportive of and related to all of those differences. So this simply says that if you've got 3 high schools, 4 high schools, 5, that maybe in fact each one of those is different, and that works as long as you don't have attendance zones and kids can pick the school that's of greatest interest to them. The implication of this, however, is that over time, is that one of these schools is probably going to attract more kids than another school. One of them may be really valid the year it opens, and 10 years later it may not be so valid because the world changes, which is the nature of where we are. And it means the district has to be more entrepreneurial and responsive over time to keep their schools up to date relative to the community they serve. That applies, though, to a bunch of these models. The very first one we showed you on academies, that academy school in Houston's only been open 5 years, and they're already fiddling with some of their programs because something's less important and something else is getting more important. So part of the lesson of all this may be for us to think about ways to make schooling flexible and responsive to the community. So let me ask you some big questions, to leave you with some big questions to ponder. Minor things for you guys to consider what you're about to undertake. Can the industrial schools that we've known for so much that all of us attended, can they really serve kids in the 20th century? Can we reform them, just sort of tinker with them, or do we need to really transform them to make them work in the years to come? I'm not going to give you answers to these. You're on your own for those. Another question was raised by this book Tony Wagner wrote, and if you put it with Thomas Friedman's book, are our best high schools sufficient in a flat world? What Tony Wagner offers, suggests, is that we often recognize really good schools versus not so good schools based on test scores. And his argument is the test scores aren't measuring what's really important in the 21st century. And so his contention is that some of our best high schools really aren't very terrific in that flat world out there, that if we measured them against other standards, that in fact we might be more worried about where we are. Another question has to do with technology. There's just a phenomenal difference in technology in the real world and in schools. And the question is, can we continue to have that enormous disparity before the kids go nuts or somebody, but we constantly have kids coming to school and telling us they have to power down, that compared to what they've got in their bedroom at home and what they use on campus is so different. And so the question is, how do we address that, and can we get away with it in effect? Another one is back to the question of serving our communities, and can any one type, I don't care whether it's the industrial type or one of the ones we've shown, can any one type serve all the needs diverse needs of a campus, of a whole district? And the other question comes up every now and then when we have these sorts of conversations. Somebody will say, I remember the open plan school. Why, that was a terrible idea and it failed, etc. Can we take the risk of trying something new? I would ask, can we take the risk of not trying something new when you consider the struggles that so many of our kids are having? We lose about 135,000 kids a year in the state of Texas to dropping out. In the United States, it's 1.25 million kids. We graduate a huge number of kids every year who need to do remedial work in order to succeed in college or in the field in work. And so the question is, what's the greater risk? To try something new or to stick with what we've got that's not serving a bunch of our kids really well? So one final question is, I wonder, we also worry about funds. When I've given talks like this, somebody always raise their hands, wow, we can't afford to do that. So I wonder though, are we really constrained by a lack of funds, or is it fuzzy priorities? Are we trying to go in 40 different directions at the same time? I truly admire those academic focus schools that keep it simple, stupid schools, simply because those guys have said, we're going to do this, we're not going to try to do the other stuff, and then they've really delivered big time. I don't think we're likely to see a lot more funds for public schools if you measure school funding as a percentage of GDP. We're already one of the highest in the world, and we're one of the richest countries in the world, which means what we're doing is even higher than other folks. I don't think it's likely that we're going to see a gigantic increase in funds. We're lucky if we don't get whacked again. And so the question is, what do we do about that? So how long do we have can we just continue on and on and on and on? I don't think we have that option. I think if you ponder all the stuff that our government folks and elected officials and candidates are talking about, I think we need to do something, that there's real pressure. What the legislature is doing to us puts on more pressure. I don't know what the answer to the last question is, but I don't think it's 100 years. I think it's something way shorter than that. Well, Thank you very much.